Give a huge hand to Valerie Bryson.
Well, thank you very much. And it does feel particularly appropriate to be talking about work-life balance in Denmark, because at least from the point of view of the rest of the world, Denmark seems to have got it about right. According to an international comparison, Denmark is actually at number 1 in 2011. It's the 38 countries, Denmark in top place. Since then, the Netherlands has moved into the number 2 spot, but Denmark's still second out of 38 nations. And it compares particularly well with the UK, where I'm from, and at number 26, and the United States at number 30. While many of you might be pleased to hear that Denmark is doing so well, a majority of Danes are still not satisfied with their work-life balance. It seems to be a universal feature of people in Western society saying they work too hard, they don't have enough time for the rest of life. But I think this kind of ranking has to be treated with a lot of caution. Measuring work-life balance is extremely tricky. The time-new studies that are often drawn on have their own problems. And the second report limited its calculations to 2 key indicators: percentage of paid employees who worked for over 50 hours a week, and time spent on leisure and personal care by full-time employees. So it's a fairly basic measure. The 2001 and 11 report was actually much more detailed, and that looked at things like commuting time and how satisfied people said they were. So if you'd use these earlier calculations, it might be that Denmark still is number 1. But however you calculate it, Denmark's high ranking is unsurprising, given its reputation in the eyes of the rest of the world, particularly somewhere like Britain. It seems to have envious policies around its workplace, time, and parental leave. The low ranking of the United States is also unsurprising, as I'm sure everybody knows, many American employees work particularly long hours. Most workers have only 2 weeks annual leave, and it's the only industrialized society to have no statutory paid maternity or parental leave at all. You have to take it out for 2 weeks holiday. Meanwhile, the UK is also doing quite badly, and it's likely to move further down the list from leave the European Union, as supporters of Brexit have declared war on red tape. And by red tape, they tend to mean measures that protect conditions of employment, like the right to parental leave and the Working Time Directive, which at least in theory restricts working hours to an average of 48 a week. Now, in 1930, the eminent economist John Maynard Keynes predicted that by now we would be working only 15 hours a week in paid employment. But even in Denmark, men work an average of 41 hours a week and women 37. And many people in Western societies report that they feel constantly stressed and harried, rushing from one thing to another with no time to do anything properly. And there's a whole new vocabulary has emerged around time famine, time poverty, time stress, hurry sickness, and of course, work-life balance, or lack of a decent work-life balance itself. Many commentators argue that overwork doesn't just cause mental and physical stress to individual workers, but it's also deeply damaging for their families and for society as a whole. It produces exhausted parents and unproductive workers. Overwork's also been blamed for a decline in voluntary and political activity and a fall in the birth rate. Discussing this raises extraordinarily complex issues, and these are so tangled up with each other, it's very difficult to know where to start and what to include. And when I started trying to plan this, every point I made seemed to run off in umpteen directions, and every statement I made demanded 1,000 qualifications. So in what follows, please remember I'll inevitably be simplifying.
And when I make generalizations, as I will, about women and men, I am aware that they are not true of all women and all men. They intersect with other social divisions. So, for example, I'll generalize, or you'll hear me saying that balancing work and family responsibilities is harder for women than men. But I know it's also difficult for very many men. And that the problems of a well-paid Western woman with a supportive husband and a nanny and a cleaner are very different from those faced by a lone parent in a badly paid, insecure employment, or the nanny who's had to leave her own children the other side of the world to get a job in the West. And be aware, too, that I am focusing on Western nations, and most of the examples I'll give will be from the UK. My own focus on time-related issues started in the early 1990s, when, as a feminist political theorist, I was looking at women's citizenship and found that writers were arguing that one reason for the lack of women in political office is that free time should be seen as a scarce political resource, and it's one that women have much less of than men. And then when I tried to check whether women really did have less free time than men, I got drawn into the whole great world of time use studies, which claim to show exactly how different groups of people spend their time, although it's perhaps not quite as simple as they sometimes claim. And then it got even more complicated as I discovered an equally fascinating world of ideas about different time cultures. I'll say more about this in a bit, but at this stage, just bear in mind that nothing about time is straightforward. Nothing is as we first sight think. The clock may be ticking remorselessly on, but sometimes time flies past, sometimes it slows down. Our bodies have got their own rhythms, and so too do human relationships. And of course, we don't yet understand the full implications of digital time. But at this point, I want to question whether our concerns about time poverty and overwork are actually valid. Are we really working longer hours than ever before? And some leading time use researchers say the evidence suggests not, that rather than a culture of overwork, we've got a culture of complaining. They say that far from an average working hours increasing, they have in fact steadily declined over the past 60 years. And at the same time, on average, we spend less time doing unpaid work in the home. Quite obviously, with things like convenience food and automatic washing machines and disposable nappies, the work involved in daily household maintenance has steadily gone down too. So this means that most people today have got more, not less, free time than ever before. So why the mismatch between reality and expectations? And one reason might be that different groups are affected differently. Whereas in previous generations, working class people worked the longest hours and professional the least, this has been reversed. So there's a rise in the number of people who may be money rich, but who are also money poor. And time use researchers have suggested that this influential minority of people who've got quite a lot of disposable income, quite a lot of political voice, are complaining, and they're getting heard and projecting their own concerns onto the whole of society. And at the same time, being busy is associated with well-paid, high-status jobs, so that overwork itself becomes a sign of status, and people will always say they're rushed and they're busy, and saying, I've got lots of time, just doesn't seem socially acceptable anymore. Another source of time stress arises from the impact of digital technology. In the past, people could simply leave their desk or factory at the end of the working day, but of course today, many employees can never clock off. They can always be phoned or emailed or Skyped wherever they are. So apparent leisure time may be polluted. You're kind of almost permanently on call. And even if you don't reply, the knowledge that messages and emails are piling up over the weekend doesn't make it a time of rest and relaxation. And another set of stresses arises from the fact that although on average individuals spend less time in paid employment, the time spent by households has risen. This, of course, is to do with the movement of women into the workplace, which has been steadily rising since the Second World War. And obviously, it's much easier to spend long hours in a factory or an office if there's somebody else at home full time, cleaning and cooking and looking after your children, than if you've got to, after your day's paid work, go home and do this yourself. And although men do more than they used to in the home and experience time pressures as a result, women still do far more, and it's usually women who particularly have to cope with juggling home and family responsibilities. And there's a separate, serious set of problems experienced by the so-called precariat. The increasing number of people, often women, in insecure, part-time and or temporary jobs, many badly paid, some on 0 hours contracts, which don't guarantee them any hours, but expect them to be available all the time. And many self-employed people who work through companies such as Uber and what some are now calling the gig economy. These workers often try to balance more than one job in order to make ends meet. They don't have lots of leisure time, but unlike the money-rich, time-poor of the professional classes, they can't buy themselves out of their time poverty by getting a nanny or a cleaner or getting a taxi home at the end of the day. So generally, while I think there can be a danger of focusing too much on relatively privileged groups, I think there certainly are problems around time pressures and the stress that this can cause. And in discussing these problems, the term work-life balance is, of course, widely used. But some writers, including myself, are somewhat critical of this term, and I have problems with the way in which it frames debate. I think we have to take it as a starting point, what some on the left used to call a transitional demand, because it's once you start pushing for work-life balance, it opens up all kinds of other things. Just to let you know where we're going, the rest of my talk I'm going to engage with the term, explore ideas around time culture, and offer some suggestions for a way forward. So problems with the term. Basically, because it seems to see work as paid work and life as everything else, implying that they're two completely distinct areas of a human experience, somehow in competition or even conflict, and they should each be kept in their proper box. And once we're inside these boxes, we're in danger of forgetting that much is an artificial division, and that we're in danger of forgetting that much important work is unpaid. And of course, people can and do contribute to society without being employed. And while most of us know this in theory, many politicians seem to forget this when they produce policies that treat people who are not in employment as scroungers, not contributing to society, sponging off the state and hard-working taxpayers. And this is particularly clear in the UK at the moment in rhetoric around strivers and shirkers, with the latter, often including lone mothers, people with disabilities, and increasingly older people who are seen as enjoying a life of leisure and early retirement at the expense of young people today. Barb Johnson will be discussing such issues in her talk on basic income tomorrow, but at this stage, just bear in mind that bringing up the next generation of citizens or supporting people in their old age is not somehow opting out of society. And the other key problem with putting work and life in separate boxes is it assumes that work can only be a sacrifice of life, a means to getting a wage at the end of the week, rather than something that might be meaningful in itself. As Karl Marx said long ago, capitalism assumes this kind of alienated labor, that you only do it to get your money. And the late capitalist economy depends on us working more and more and more so that we can consume more and more and more with no time to reflect on what we're doing or get off the work to spend roller coaster. But many people do enjoy their work. Many people are motivated by more than their pay packet. They want to do it because it's interesting or fulfilling, or because they want to make a contribution to society, or because they enjoy the companionship and the sense of purpose that work can provide. And in particular, of course, women have fought for the right to work outside the home, not just to get economic independence, but also for the sense of being part of a wider world. And in truth, many women, like many men, find going out to work easier and more pleasurable than looking after their own family at home all day. So we need to move beyond this artificial distinction and reconceptualize what we mean by work, what we mean by life. The second key problem is that it sidelines some underlying issues about the quality and meaning of our time and how we relate to it. And from this wider perspective, the problem isn't simply that we don't have enough time, but that our lives are dominated by the wrong kind of time. And this is moving the debate a bit further on. And the starting point for this is the argument that our perceptions of time, our understandings of time and our relationship to time are not simply given and natural, but to a significant extent, they're socially and culturally produced. This means they have a history and that they may be very different in the future. There's a vast literature on this, starting with the pioneering work by E.P. Thompson, and Barbara Adam is just one of many important recent writers. And Thompson traced a shift in Western societies over the centuries from what he called natural or traditional time to the clock time of the industrial capitalism and factory production. He argued that traditional time culture is based on the natural rhythms of the season and the tasks that have to be done. You get up when it's light, you go to bed when it's dark, you do your work until it's done, and then you rest in a kind of endless cycle. So your relationship to time is natural, task-oriented, and cyclical. Yep. Oh, further away? Is it echo? Is that better? Yep, better. Okay, thanks. With the development of capitalism and industrialization, he said that this traditional time gradually gave way to the modern time of the factory, the wage worker. This modern time is commodified. Time is money. It's bought and sold. You sell your time to an employer, not agreeing to do a particular task. Time is measured, invested, managed, freed up, or if we're lazy or bad time managers, it may be wasted. It's linear. Instead of the endless cycle of the seasons, we've got time's arrow moving towards the future. And perhaps above all, modern time is clock time, ticking remorselessly away. And this way of thinking about time is alien to many other cultures, but taken for granted by most of us. And meanwhile, the time is money logic of global capitalism has been taken to an extreme in an age of digital time. I've just mentioned there Robert Hassan and Wayne Hope as two writers writing in this field. And you've got all the stresses that digital time are bringing and the differences and the speeding up. But I think it's important to note that digital time has perhaps a basic similarity with clock time because it takes as given that time is commodified and that it can be measured, while it fantastically exaggerates capitalism's focus on the short term. And I think there's a problem today with the extension of clock time into all areas of life. Thompson had noted that the process has been uneven and that we can't escape entirely from traditional time. And he noted that mothers at home with young children were still partly in traditional time because their work was still largely task-oriented and determined by natural rhythms rather than by the clock. You change the nappy when it's dirty, not because it's 4 o'clock. And as many other writers have said, the time culture of young children is not clock-oriented. It's very much slower, very much in the present, cyclical and repetitive, with the same processes going on and over again. And other forms of care, such as care for elderly or disabled people, is similar. And so too are personal relationships. If a friend phones in distress and needing to talk, it's not much help to say, oh, I think, get my diary out, I think I can fit you in next Thursday morning. So family life and relationships shouldn't be reduced to a tick list of activities with quality time squeezed into a tight to-do list. They need to be flexible and open-ended and often more leisurely. That's to say, they require a different kind of temporal logic in which efficiency shouldn't be the first consideration. Very different from the logic of the workplace. But the logic of the workplace increasingly dominates private and family life as well. So that unpaid family and personal time has to be fitted in around the demands of employment, and it too has to be speeded up, hyper-organised and planned. And the results can be extremely stressful. If anyone's looked after a small child, trying to speed them up can be very counterproductive. Getting them to eat their breakfast quicker because they're going to be late for nursery, they have a temper tantrum and they're even later. And when care is done as a form of paid work, sorry, I should have it. It's done as a form of paid work, the clash of time cultures is even greater. And in many countries, care is increasingly seen as a profit-making industry rather than a public right or service, with the aim of processing as many clients as possible in as little possible time. And even when care is publicly provided, there's considerations of cost effectiveness. For example, public policy in the UK favours helping elderly people remain in their home as long as possible, and care workers may visit them every day to help them get up and dressed. Sounds great in principle, but rather than this being an enjoyable process, many local authorities allow just 15 minutes for it to get somebody up and dressed and breakfasted. Result, confusion and stress. So the problem isn't just that people don't have enough time, but their activities are being pushed into the wrong kind of logic of speed and efficiency and cost effectiveness. And overall, there are major problems, more deep-seated than the term work-life balance suggests. So problems, where do we go from here? We do have individual choices, many of us. Many have little choice. They have to work long hours to put food on the table, and any time away from work is taken up with family responsibilities. But many of us can make choices. And if you feel your time has got out of balance, you might consider the trade-off that you make between time and money and look at your priorities. As individuals, you might raise time-related issues in talking to friends, in workplace committees, in unions and political parties. It's important to get people talking about things, to get them on the agenda. And I would say as individuals, try to slow down sometimes, smell the roses, treat time as an end in itself, and don't judge everything in terms of results. Just sometimes tear up your to-do list and remember that if someone says, what have you been doing all day? And you say, not much, but I've really enjoyed myself. That's not necessarily a bad answer. And beyond individual choices, there are, of course, a whole range of employment policies that could help, including a whole raft of rights and protections, parental and family leave, provisions for job sharing, right for part-timers, flexible retirement age. Here, of course, some nations are doing better than others, and we need to build on their experience, protect what has been gained, and share best practices. Employment policies would certainly include effective protection against working hours, long working hours, and a general reduction in the normal working week. And this might be a very drastic reduction in the working week. We might eventually, with automation, be in a position to realize the dream that Keynes had of a 15-hour week. And so the problem of unemployment is reconceptualized again as the opportunity for greater leisure. And this is on the left-wing agenda now in a way that it wasn't just a few years ago. And we need to treat paid work as a worthy and serious profession rather than something that's done by people who can't do anything else. We need state policies to recognise and support unpaid work. We need to recognise that care is not just a private responsibility, but a right of all citizens, and that affordable, good quality care for children and frail and elderly people should not and cannot be a profit-making industry. We need to ensure that those who care for family members can be economically independent, rather than dependent on their spouse or forced into poverty. And an important policy here might be the introduction of basic income, which Barb will be discussing tomorrow. And taken together, such policies imply some very radical challenges to dominant social and economic assumptions. They imply, if you take them together, more than the sum of the parts. They imply that we should resist the tyranny of the clock, a big ask. We should challenge the work to spend culture. We should shift towards a more woman-centered perspective that assumes that normal workers have caring responsibilities. So work-life balance isn't just a women's issue. We should also reject all the neoliberal assumptions that celebrate free markets and low taxation and demonize the state. There is a role for the state and for collective provisions. We need to reject high levels of inequality, and we need to reject the assumption that economic growth, which forces us to produce more in order to consume more, is desirable as an end in itself. There are no easy solutions, but small changes in attitudes and choices and policies can have a cumulative effect. There are measures we can take individually and collectively, and because they're interconnected, they can have knock-on effects. There's a possibility of moving from a vicious circle that many of us feel trapped in to a more virtuous circle, to a world in which work and life become less and less in conflict. At the very least, perhaps, we can have a world that looks a little less like the United States and a bit more like Denmark. Thank you.